Our nation is in trouble. I'm talking about our government and our culture. And the only one answer to what we are facing is Jesus. Jesus said in John chapter 12, verse 32, and when I am lifted up, I will draw all men unto me. We need to lift up Jesus in our nation and across the world. So we will be considering the politics and cultural issues of our day in light of God's Word. So today, let's consider this. Hi, everybody, and welcome to Consider This. I'm your host, Keith Allen, and the purpose of this show is to lift up Jesus Christ in our nation and across the world. I say this every week. This is not an opinion show. The only opinion that matters is God's. So, today, let's consider this. Congressional term limits. Hot topic right now in the political world, and we're going to start with two scriptures, both out of the book of Proverbs, chapter 20. And I'm reading out of the NIV version. I'm going to read 2010 and then 2023. They say the same thing. And we know when God says the same thing a couple of times, it's pretty important. Proverbs 20, verse 10. Differing weights and differing measures. The Lord detests them both. That's Proverbs 20 and 10. Now drop down to Proverbs 20, verse 23. The Lord detests differing weights, and dishonest scales do not please him. A couple of weeks ago, I told you last week, a couple of weeks ago, I went to the Texas State Capitol building in Austin, Texas, and had a good time. It was legislative day. I think last week, we got to kind of bounce around the halls of the Capitol, and you could jump into anybody's office you wanted, with respect, and kind of introduce yourself to people, get to know people. And certainly for what I have planned in my future, it was actually a very good day to make connections with different people, different lawmakers, etc. But one of the hot topics while we were there is this whole term limits. And it's real hot on the Republican agenda for both the House of Representatives and the Senate as far as term limits goes. This is what's being pushed. And there's several bills out there, and I'm going to talk about one today. The one that's getting the most attention and support is House Joint Resolution 12, so HJR 12. And I just want to read it. It was put forth by Congressman Ralph Norman out of South Carolina's 5th District. And Senator Ted Cruz here in Texas, he also put up a bill. So he signed on to this one. But this is the one that seems to be getting a lot of attention. And here's what it is. I'm going to give it, there's a lot of, language to it, but I'm going to give it to you here in a nutshell. The proposed amendment, because it has to be an amendment to the Constitution. The proposed amendment makes an individual who has served 2 terms in the Senate ineligible for appointment or re-election. And then for a House member, the maximum is 3 terms. So 6 years. So 12 years for Senate, 6 years for the House. And for me, everybody's been talking about term limits for years. And you say, well, how do the American people feel about that? Well, whether you look at Pew Research or any of the big guys that do the polling for the United States, 87% of Americans, and that's Republican, Democrat, and independents. 87% of Americans say, yes, we need term limits. And I think most of us know this, if not intrinsically, we know it because we've read it. But when our nation was formed, the people that served, and that's what it was a service position in the House or the Senate. They were there to serve the people. It was never meant, the reason it wasn't term limits is nobody would have wanted to do it. It was a service position. It wasn't where anybody was going to get rich. So people did it as a way of serving our country as we were building as a nation. Well, So when you look at it today, where people are in Congress forever, and they're getting rich, God knows how, but they're getting rich. When you think about that, you think, well, 87% of Americans say, well, of course we should be doing this. Here's what I can tell you. This resolution that's out there right now, so far, and this is just as of like last week, and you can Google this. I'm not making this stuff up. On this bill, this House Joint Resolution 12, again, sponsored by, in case anybody wants to look it up, it was introduced on January 6th of this year, 2025, by House of Representative member Ralph Norman, South Carolina, Republican District 5. Look that up. Here's where that bill sits so far. The article that you read online says 140 members of Congress have signed on to this. And that includes 23 senators. Because they want it to sound, the media wants you to think that this is a lot of people that have signed on for it. I want you to think about what I just said. 87% of Americans said, we want term limits for House of Representatives and for the Senate, for all of Congress. Well, if you have 117 House members that have signed on to it, that's 27%. We're missing 50%. We're not in line with the American people. When you look at the Senate, 23 senators out of, oh, by the way, there's 100. I think we know that. 23%. So again, where's the other 50-some percent? They're not in line with what the American people want. You wonder why. We'll get to that in a minute. But I think I told you this last week, and if I didn't, some of you probably saw this online, but I don't know, Charlie, if you can get a close-up of this. I'll hold it here for just a second in case you want to zoom in on it. But here's the deal. When I was out there last week, there was a group of people for Texas term limits, and they wanted either sitting members of Congress or candidates for either the House or Senate to sign on to this pledge saying that they would support term limits. I'll read this to you that I just showed you. I, Keith Allen, pledge that as a member of Congress, I will co-sponsor and vote for the U.S. term limits amendment of 3 House terms and 2 Senate terms and no longer limit. I signed on to that. Let me tell you, many senators have not. And what's really interesting, it wouldn't even affect the ones that are in the Senate now. It would be more of once this is ratified, so people would be able to finish the terms they're in. But you still have people, because they have family members, they have friends, they have connections that they want to bring up after them. Let me tell you, Congress, whether it's House or Senate, it has become a business. Somebody said not too long ago, we were just kind of chit-chatting about it, and they said, yeah, let me tell you, Congress has kind of become one of the good old boys clubs where, it's a rich people's club. And that's really what it's fast becoming. So I started digging around, and I'm thinking, why wouldn't they want term limits? Like, what can I give you all as the audience to go look at? And I found this article from June 18th, 2024, and it was written by this Elsa Blease, B-L-E-A-S-E. I'll put the website on the bottom here, and you can just go to it after we talk if you want to see the information. And even at the bottom of the articles, she cites where she's got all this information from. But here's what she has. This is why I believe a lot of the reason why people don't want term limits, and I mean the ones that are in there. In a comprehensive study, and this is from the 115th Congress, the combined wealth of all members at that time amounted to at least $2.43 billion, marking a 20% gains for members of Congress as far as their income by year. Presumably, the non-member wealthy are also quite talented financially. In other words, the average wealth of representatives grew over, and they took a period from 2004 to 2014. Their wealth grew 25% more than the average U.S. resident. Tell me, are they really that smart? Because let me tell you, a lot of them in there, they're lawyers, they're whatever. They're not economic majors and they're not stock, gurus. They've become that. Concerns regarding politicians engaging in insider trading have persisted over time. There's many instances of members of Congress leveraging their positions. I'm not going to go deep into all of this. Again, you can go to this article if you want, if you just want to look at it. And then she talks about there's correlations between Congress member investments and legislative priorities. How does that work? You can get to this article, and there's a little bit more. The influence, listen to this, the influence of major donors, lobbyists, and special interests on the decision made by members of Congress is a concern shared by a significant portion of the people. Influence on congressional decisions, a sentiment echoed by nearly the same proportion of Democrats and Democratic leaners, 80%. Majorities within both parties express the view that lobbyists and special interests and large employers within the lawmakers' district wield undue influence. And then she ends the article with Congress members have such a strong influence on how our markets move due to their positions and affiliations. So this is my long way of telling you, when you say, why wouldn't a sitting member of Congress, House or Senate, why wouldn't they agree with term limits? Well, for one, they get rich in Congress. There's a whole bunch of people getting rich in Congress. You can connect your own dots. I'm not going to make specific accusations. All I'll tell you is where there's smoke, there is fire. Now let's go to, I want you to just go back to the scripture reference that I talked about earlier in Proverbs 20 and 10 and 20 and 23, where the Lord detests unequal weights and measures. Let me tell you where that hits me and why I use that scripture today. I'm getting ready, and most of you know this, I'm getting ready to officially announce my candidacy for U.S. Senate representing the great state of Texas for 2026. So my opponent will be John Cornyn. So that's the seat that's up in 2026. Somewhere near the end of March, I believe, will be the primary where it'll be who's going to be the GOP nominee that will ultimately in November be up against the Democratic nominee for the Senate seat. I wonder if it'll be Beto. Funny. But I will be going up against John Cornyn. Now, I'm not slamming John Cornyn specifically. I'm actually slamming the process and how all of this business works in D.C. In government, actually. It's not just D.C., it's state too. In 2024, John Cornyn was not on the ballot. So, in other words, his seat wasn't up. Ted Cruz's was up. He wasn't on the ballot, but he raised over $33 million. $33 million that he raised in fundraising, and he wasn't even on the ballot. And when you get into, and it's public information, you can go to the FEC website and you can see where he gets his money. Yes, there's individual donors, but let me tell you, there's BlackRock, there's U.S. Airlines, there's a lot of companies that are just dumping money into this guy's campaign. You have to ask yourself, why? And then you ask yourself, well, then what chance does a guy that hasn't ever been in government have to run for U.S. Senate? Because I think anybody that knows me, and certainly the audience that talks to me, personally, knows that I'm not in this thing for the money. I honestly love our country. I love Jesus. I love our country, and I want to make a difference
Well, when you think about this, John Cornyn kicked off his campaign on February 26th of this year. In his opening event, raised $100,000. Let me tell you, when I think about how are the weights even between a newcomer like me or you or Charlie or anybody else that would say, I want to serve our country. You take a guy like John Cornyn, he has been in office, and I'm not picking on him, he's not the only one, but he's already had 4 6-year terms. So he's already been in for 24 years. And now he wants another 6-year term. He's 73 years old. So now he wants another 6-year term. Why would that be? So he wants to be able to say he served in the Senate for 30 years. Let me tell you something. There is something wrong with our country when you have people, members of government, that have made it their job. I even tried to find his net worth, and what you find online is John Cornyn's net worth looks to be $1.8 million, but you can't tell because most of it is not disclosed. Well, let me tell you, that's probably the same with most members of Congress, whether it's House or Senate. I can tell you this, my net worth is not $1.8 million. And I'm not running for Congress because I want to make a career of it. I am a person that's been in business leadership for the better part of 30 years. I love our country. I love the God that I serve. I love my family. What I want to do is I want to get into Congress for 1 or 2 years, and I want to serve our country. And I want to go home, and I want somebody else to come in and serve our country. Understand what I'm up against, because the weights are not even. When you get somebody that's been in there that long, there's a whole bunch of connections, and I will tell you, I believe there's a whole bunch of funny business going on, and I think anybody that looks at it with critical eyes would say, yeah, there's something going on. Do we really want somebody in there for 20 and 30 years? Nah, 2 and 2 aren't adding up right now. 2 and 2 don't equal 5. Here's what John Cornyn's going to have behind him, and this is why we need term limits. It's not just him. Here's how it affects me, though. John Cornyn, because he's been in there that long and because he raises so much money with these relationships, quote unquote, that he has, he's got the establishment behind him. So he's got the RNC, he's got the Republican National, he's got them behind him 100%. He's got even the local GOP offices because he's the incumbent. So when it comes to, he's going to, when a guy like me says, how am I going to get signs, flyers, people to phone bank, people to walk, I'm going to have to figure out, how do you have a campaign where you're able to pay for all that stuff? Well, a guy like John Cornyn, a guy like Mitch McConnell, any of these guys have been in Congress for a long time. They look at a guy like me. When John Cornyn hears Keith Allen's running, let me tell you, he's going to say, that's a fly on the wall. I'm not worried about a flea. That guy's a flea on a dog's back. He's not paying any attention to me because he knows, man, my machine is a money-making machine. And you think about some of these guys who have been in Congress for that long, and you say, what do they stand for? What have they done for the state of Texas or wherever they happen to be serving, their district, etc.? And what you find is what they've done more than anything, what they've been successful at is being in Congress and being a senator or being a House of Representatives member. As far as what do they get done, I look at a guy like John Cornyn, I think I said it last week. Here's what he did get done. We had the first major gun legislation passed in 2022 since 1994. First major gun legislation passed was in 2022, co-sponsored. The Democrats co-sponsored it with John Cornyn to pass the largest gun legislation since 1994. So you say, you know, But will he get reelected? Well, he believes so because he has all these. He doesn't have to worry about signs, flyers. He doesn't have to worry about, mailers going out to people's houses. How do I get phone banking to happen? There's a machine behind him. The newcomers, it's weighted against you. Now, would that stop the average person from running? It absolutely does. In fact, there's 5 or 6 people right now, maybe 7, that if you go to ballotpedia.com, you'll see their names are in there for running for that same seat 2026. You'll see me in there. But if you say, will they really run? How far will they run? They're not going to run very far, because what you find is, you don't have money. You've got to leave your full-time job in order to do this. It's not like you can do this part-time. You're running up against, in most cases, somebody that's going to come up with $20 to $30, $35 million that's working against the average Joe that wants to come and serve our nation. So, of course, they don't want term limits, because the longer they stay in, the more money they have at their disposal, the more financial influence they have. But I'm going to give you the end to a good story. So why is Keith saying he's going to run? There's a very, very familiar story that most of you know, the story of David and Goliath. And I'll just, for those of you that don't know, I'm going to assume everybody knows the story of David and Goliath, high level. The Philistines are the arch enemies of the people of Israel. And the Philistines and the Israelite army, they line up in battle formation against each other. And the Philistines are going to send out their champion, this guy Goliath, who's 9.5 feet tall. And they say, hey, if you send out one guy, we're going to send out our guy. If you beat him, we're your slaves. If you beat us, you beat our guy, we're your slaves. So it's all going to be dependent on these 2 guys, and the Israelites are scared to death. The king of Israel at the time is King Saul. Saul is scared to death, and here comes little old David, who wasn't even supposed to be there. He wasn't even in the army. He's a shepherd boy that came in to make a quick delivery, and he sees this going on. David's like, hey, who is this guy? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that's coming against the armies of the living God? And so these 2 are going to do battle. In fact, Saul tells him, no, you can't fight this guy. He's been a warrior since his youth. You're just a shepherd. You don't have any experience. You can't do this. And David's like, hey, you know what? God has delivered me the lion and the bear. This is going to be no different. He had confidence because he knew what God had done for him in his life. And when I tell you, why is Keith running for Senate? Let me tell you something. I know what God has done for me in my life. He has elevated me in everything I've ever done. When it comes to business, I don't know that I've ever been qualified for any role I've ever had, but you know what? I've always had success because I love people and I put Jesus first in my life. And I have always won at anything I've done because I know that my strength comes from the Lord. And if He's fighting my battles, I'm in pretty good shape. It's worked out for me my whole life. So let me just read this real quick to you. 1 Samuel chapter 17. It's the story of David and Goliath. And I'm going to get near the end here. I'm just going to read verses 41 through 47. And this is where David's facing Goliath. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. Verse 42, he looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Verse 44, come here, he said, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. Listen to what David says. In verse 45, David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin. And I'm going to stop there for just a second. When you listen to what David said, I'm gonna replace the words of sword, spear, and javelin. Here's what David really said. He said, David said to the Philistine, you come against me with the weapons of this world, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. I'll strike you down and cut off your head this very day. I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or not by spear. It's not by the things of this world that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's, and He will give all of you into our hands. And I think most of you know how the story ended. David pulls out his sling and stone and puts a stone right in the center of Goliath's forehead. And then as he falls down, David pulls out Goliath's sword and chops his head off with his own sword. David won. But if it wasn't for the Lord, David didn't have a chance. And when you look at people applying or campaigning or saying, I want to serve our nation in Congress, whether it's House or Senate, they have that same feeling. It's like, I have no shot. I'm going against Goliath. Well, let me tell you in this case, somebody told me this the other day. That's why I brought it up. Somebody said, boy, you're gonna go against John Cornyn? That's a real David and Goliath story. And I said, geez, I sure hope so, because I think we know how that turned out for Goliath. Keep me in your prayers if you would. This was about term limits. Obviously, there's an underlying message there, but term limits is a lot more than just limiting the terms. It's the reason you want that. You don't want career politicians. I will just read a quick. Ted Cruz had something to say when he co-sponsored this bill. I want you to listen to what he said, because it's very telling. This is the note from Senator Ted Cruz. Term limits are critical to fixing what's wrong with Washington, D.C. The Founding Fathers envisioned a government of citizen legislators who would serve for a few years and return home, not a government run by a small group of special interests and lifelong permanently entrenched politicians who prey upon the brokenness of Washington to govern in a manner that is totally unaccountable to the American people. Let me tell you, that's what we have in Washington, D.C. right now. Term limits bring about accountability that is long overdue, and I urge my colleagues to advance this amendment along to the states so that it may be quickly ratified and become a constitutional amendment. God bless Ted Cruz and those that sign on to this. And then the Representative Norman, who put the bill out, he stated, elected office should represent a short-term privilege of public service, not a career choice. That's what these are. It's career politicians. Those of us in Congress ought to serve for a reasonable period of time and then return home to live under the laws we enacted. That's why I've proposed a constitutional amendment to establish term limits in the legislative branch. And I am honored that Senator Cruz has introduced a companion bill over in the Senate. This effort will go a long way to positively impact American politics, and I appreciate Senator Cruz's leadership on this important issue. Folks, we need term limits. More to come from Keith. If you want to, you can check us out on considerthispodcast.net, N-E-T, or you can reach us on our website, considerthisrgv.com, or you can email me direct, k.allen@considerthispodcast.net. Until next week, we love you and we will see you then.